My name is Joel Sill. We're in Beverly Hills, California, and I'm an independent music supervisor and a music publisher. The broadest definition, I think, is the acquisition and exploitation of songs. But what it specifically means historically is somewhat different than what it is currently. Historically, publishers started as song pluggers. They'd travel around to live performers and give them sheet music and plug them with this idea that they should play this piece of sheet music on their show. And eventually that changed into giving them songs to record when the music business started selling 78s, because money's generated every time a record is sold, and money's generated every time a record is played on the air. And the source of the music business is the song. Without the song, you don't have anything to perform, and with nothing to perform, you have no artist to do anything. So to me, it's always been the source of the industry. It's a partnership with the songwriter or songwriters, effectively. It's some level of a partnership. The traditional music publisher historically worked with the songwriters, gave them a home, a business home, provided them with opportunities to write material, gave them guidance in writing material, and then attempted to get that material recorded by certain recording artists. So it was a collaboration in the earlier days. Eventually, when songwriters recognized that the business was changing, publishers also recognized that around the time that self-contained groups and recording artists who wrote their own songs didn't need that much outside material. So different relationships sprung up with the music publisher, in which to a large degree they became protectors of the rights, the administrators, and ensured proper collections for record sales and performing rights. Airplay, uses in movies and television were accounted and collected correctly. Some songwriters really benefit from collaborations with other songwriters. Some songwriters really can manage on their own. Examples are Diane Warren certainly can manage on her own. And I think one of the great things about collaborations is that songwriters get the opportunity to figure out musical solutions with the help of other people that they normally wouldn't come up with themselves. So it expands their ability to write better. Well, I think from the collaborative songwriter and sometimes publishers, good publishers can really help the songwriters. Yeah, solve some of the problems musically they have. You know, if they stumble into a bridge, or if they're having a problem opening up a chorus properly, if they've got a lyric which is about a positive subject and the melody is a minor melody and they can't figure out why it doesn't seem to work together. Sometimes the publisher or the collaborating songwriter can analyze it and help solve the problem. I was a publisher back at Truesdale Wingate Music, which was Dunhill Records, and a young songwriter came in who was living in his Volkswagen van, and it was Kenny Loggins. And you know, Kenny needed the opportunity to get into the business in a sense, and also he needed the money to survive, so he didn't have to live in his van anymore. So it was mutually beneficial in that it gave him a platform and some revenue so that he could concentrate more on pure songwriting than just on, you know, what side street he was going to sleep on that night, you know, in his van. So the circumstances vary, but I think the important thing is to find someone to work with who's a captain for your music. I think that's the the real key. At a certain point, a lot of artists, songwriters get to a point where it's really a matter of getting a great deal so that their monies will be collected properly, and they don't necessarily need the input that the traditional publisher used to give. It's a great business. It always has been. I mean, you see there's very few companies left. They've consolidated because the corporations have recognized the value of the asset. The song is to a large degree a non-recreatable asset. So you take a catalog like the Motown catalog, Jobette songs, that's not going to come around again. So it's distinctly unique, and it has an inherent value because people will constantly go back and mine that catalog and re-record those pieces, as well as those songs always being used, those records always being used in period piece films, television shows, played on the radio. So it's an ongoing asset that you can continually re-exploit and hopefully keep the copyrights alive for years and years and years. The first thing was to have an instinct, and a feeling for the music, whether it's a gut instinct or if it's a gut instinct and you're plugged into where music is at, because it's obviously constantly changing. And I think you need both of those things. I mean, to a large degree, music is always glandular too. So, it's very subjective. I mean, to talk about music is always abstract, and then when you hear it, it's always subjective. So, how do you deal with that? It's got to be at a personal level. And it's peculiar because it's at such a personal level, but then you're looking to get the approval of everybody else, so when it becomes a hit, you get the approval. My brother, Chuck Kay, and I had acquired a number of copyrights together. We had a company called Windswept Pacific, and in the acquisition of the companies we bought, there were tons and tons of well-known copyrights, but also to bring in new blood, new material, new songs to the company is also something that you want to do to a certain extent so that you're building the copyright base. In some companies, it doesn't make a difference anymore. A company like EMI or Warner Chappell, they have a million copyrights, so I mean they certainly don't need more copyrights, but in a smaller company, more copyrights are good because it gives you an opportunity for more exploitation and more chances to discover the Black Eyed Peas or John Legend, stuff like that. I don't think it's become more or less important. I think the relativity of both of them is that if you want to use a song, you need to have it in some kind of recorded form for it to have value. And if you want to make a recording, you need a song. So I mean, the basis of it has remained the same. The forms of distribution are starting to change. And I think that clearly that always changes any industry, any form of change of distribution. And I think now, for example, we're in the equivalent of a 45 business, like the old 45 singles, but we're in the e-single business, if you will. Historically, in the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s, the single was the locomotive to sell the album. And that didn't change much all the way through people replacing their libraries with CDs. But what changed was people making the distinction that instead of buying an entire CD, which had 12 or 14 cuts, of which they only liked 2 or 3, they could now select those 2 or 3, and they could compile their own library. And it doesn't even have to be an album anymore. So it's changed the form of the business and made it much more personal in terms of personal programming, which is great, but it's just trying to find itself right now because it's going through dramatic changes. I think radio has remained pretty much unaffected because the general places that people listen to radio are usually while they're traveling. I think that terrestrial radio is going to be affected by satellite radio. And I think that how radio is being affected is if there is any erosion of its listener base because of iPods and MP3s, that means less advertising dollars because the radio's numbers go down in that city, and advertisers will spend less to reach that demographic through that radio station. So that may have an impact. Whereas satellite radio is subscription, so they don't rely on advertisers. That's why they can target so many different types of audiences. When I was a publisher back at Dunhill Records, we published a group that was known as Steppenwolf, and there was a TV producer named Bert Schneider, and he had a couple of partners, Bob Rafelson and Steve Blauner. They produced the Monkees TV show, and they wanted to make a movie for drive-ins. They called them soft tops. So they figured they had a little business model, which was they'd make this movie for $400,000. It'd be a motorcycle movie. It'd have some drugs in it, and if they made it right, they could make $1 million from it. So they'd have a profit of about $600,000. So they didn't have enough money for music, so they didn't want to score the film. And Bert called and said, would I come and look at the picture? Because he wanted to use a song from Steppenwolf. I think 2 of them actually, Born to be Wild and The Pusher. So I went and looked at the film, and I was like 22 at the time. So I was like right in the age bracket that I totally felt what was going on. The movie was Easy Rider, okay? So I totally was like living what was going on in the picture, and just felt really strongly that I should put a soundtrack together for this. And we were licensing things. Jimi Hendrix was like $750 or something, or $250, and we got the master by trading cassette manufacturing rights in Canada to Warner Brothers Records, and we put the soundtrack album out on Dunhill, and it immediately took off. It was a giant soundtrack at the time. It was the first compilation rock and roll film soundtrack. Maybe earlier was Blackboard Jungle, and Alan Freed had some back in the 50s, but this was the early one, in terms of rock and roll. And the film did an amazing amount of business. The record did great, and I became like a flavor of the month in Hollywood. I had no idea what I was doing. It was great on Easy Rider because you look at the scenes, and you'd smoke a doobie and you'd crank up your JBLs as loud as you could, and if something worked, it was terrific, But the responsible nature of doing that later on became evident when I got phone calls to put some music to other films. And I did do some other movies. I went to work on a film called Fat City, which Ray Stark produced and John Huston directed. And I had a great time on that. I didn't know anything about screen credit, so I never asked for screen credit. I was just happy to get a check, you know, for doing stuff I loved. And eventually I went to work at Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss's publishing company, Irving Almo. And I worked with Herb and Jerry, who are just amazingly terrific guys, for years. And they allowed me, along with my brother, with Chuck, the opportunity to try and develop a kind of a film music branch, you know, a little brand for the company. And I did Movies of the Week, where I'd take music from Irving Almo's catalog and put it in these Movies of the Week. I'd do sports shows like NBC basketball shows. Almost anything that moved, I'd try and stick some of our music on, you know. And eventually this led to a film at Paramount Pictures in which they were having some problems finishing the score. So I was called in and scored the picture with, I think it was Cat Stevens and Paul Williams recordings and songs. And through that project I met Don Simpson, who was the head of production at Paramount. And Don liked the idea of doing something a little more progressive in terms of music and films. So I was hired to run the music department at Paramount Pictures. And that was really the training ground. The staff was an amazing group of people. They were known as Diller's Killers. It was Barry Diller was the chairman, Michael Eisner was the president, Frank Mancuso Sr. was the president of marketing, Don Simpson was the president of production, and under him was Jeff Katzenberg, Don Steele, Ricardo Mestras, and David Kirkpatrick. So the meetings were always interesting, but it was a great studio to work at in terms of the projects, and with a young production department like that, gave me the opportunity to imbue some more progressive music into some of the films. And probably about the fifth film that I was working on, I met Taylor Hackford, who was directing a film called An Officer and a Gentleman. And from that film and working with Taylor, I put together the song Up Where We Belong, which was written by Will Jennings. I brought Will in, who had been a writer at Irving Almo. And I brought Will in to write with Jack Nietzsche, who did the score. And he came up with this terrific song. And then it was the idea of matching the characters, like Richard Gere and Deborah Winger. We had multiple choices. The artist could have been Joe Cocker, Bob Seger, or Jennifer Warnes, or Rita Coolidge. We could have mixed and matched any of them, and the availability at the time was Joe Cocker, who I loved, and Jennifer Warren, who was like, you know, the angel, the angelic voice. So, and then I brought in Stuart Levine to produce the record, and Stuart made an amazing record, and the record went on, and the head of marketing, Frank Mancuso, was concerned, but he didn't think he could open the film on Richard Gere and Deborah Winger's name at the time. He wanted another element to sell the film with. So this was the other element he was hoping for. He had asked me for something. And we finished the record. Frank was a big supporter of it. And he was such a big supporter that he agreed to shoot what was probably one of the first studio music videos. And the legal department was scared to death because all the unions and guilds, and this hadn't been done before. And Frank said, let's do it. This is for promotion. And the song came out and went to #1. The film came out and became a really giant hit. I think it did then $125 million domestically. And then the song went on and won the Academy Award. So my relationship with Frank in terms of being able to determine marketing the film to the core audience through music became a vital kind of undercarriage on setting some of these projects up. And the next one we set up was Flashdance. And that turned out great too, you know? So we just, you know, caught this run of things, you know, and just we were able to kind of design the music so that it fit the same demographic that the film and the film's audience did, and we could market the music to, you know, thousands of radio stations across the country and get free advertising because the songs would say generally the titles, like What a Feeling, the Irene Cara piece. Actually, we just put the word Flashdance ... in front of the title. So it said Flashdance, What a Feeling, right? So that the DJs would say Flashdance, What a Feeling, Irene Cara. So, you know, these were great little marketing things that really helped, and then it became a revenue stream as well, because we sold, I think, 10 or 12 million albums on Flashdance. And so there was another area where the studio now had revenue that made it valuable to go ahead in terms of paying for the marketing. It was an investment in the film, and the return was in box office and in record sales. So that was pretty much that story. I then went to Warner Communications, where I was in charge of music for all filmed entertainment. And I had a terrific time there working with the guys at Warner's, which to me was the best corporation you could ever imagine. Steve Ross, the legendary executive, was running Warner Communications at the time, and Bob Daly and Terry Semmel were running the studio. And it was just fantastic working there, the opportunities, the range of experience from films like Purple Rain to The Killing Fields. Just sensational. I mean, some of it that was not pop-oriented was fantastic, working with people like Ennio Morricone, seeing people like Jerry Goldsmith or John Williams come up with these scores in the more traditional pictures. It was just fantastic, you know, just absolutely fantastic. So it gave me a range of experience you could never get just being an independent. Because as an independent you might do 3 films a year, but at a studio you'd oversee as many as 25 to 30 if it was a busy year. So it was great. But eventually I started to sense a bit of an enthusiasm decay, and wanted to work more directly and intensely with the filmmakers on the projects I cared about all the way through. I didn't want to have to like get them going and then leave and get another one going and leave and make sure there weren't problems or smother the problems with money or whatever the issues were. I just wanted to get involved with the project all the way through. So I left Warner's and went in business with Taylor Hackford. And we started doing soundtracks, and they were producing films. And the first film we did the soundtrack for was a film called Mannequin, And again, we had an enormous hit with the Starship, Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. And then the next picture that we did was La Bamba, which was a New Vision's picture. It was our picture. We had acquired a life story and the copyrights to the songs, and Columbia agreed to finance the film. And they gave us $6 million to make the movie, and we needed a little more, so I pre-sold the soundtrack, and we used the advance from the soundtrack to get a little more cash in the kitty, and we went on, and that worked out really well. Then a few years later, Taylor wanted to design his own studio, and he got an enormous amount of financing. And I didn't want to work at a studio again, because that meant whoever the studio made a deal with, I wouldn't have a choice as to if I wanted to work with them or not. I'd be required to. And I kind of enjoyed my gunslinger mode, you know, where I could pick and choose. So I talked to my brother Chuck, who was the chairman of Warner Chappell Music, and we talked about the idea of creating a new publishing company, and we got financing from a Japanese company called Fujisankei Communications to acquire catalogs and songs. And the idea was, instead of trying to get cover records in the traditional way, we would hire music supervisors, because we felt the income stream now had switched from people covering records as being the most valuable form of revenue to films and television and soundtracks being more valuable. So we hired some terrific people, Bud Carr and Bones Howe, a whole group, and we started this publishing company, Windswept Pacific, and built it into a really nice business. We acquired Morris Levy's catalog, which had Jimmy Rogers, and it had all the Connie Francis hits, and it had Duke Ellington, and we acquired Willie Nelson's catalog. We acquired the Four Seasons catalog. We acquired John Cougar Mellencamp's, Rod Stewart's, and the Isley Brothers, and Edgar Winter, and built it into a terrific business. And eventually sold it, and Chuck went sailing, and I moved up to the mountains for a while. But I continued doing music for films, which I really loved. And not long after we sold Windswept, I was introduced to a director named Bob Zemeckis, and went to work on Bob's film Forrest Gump, and just had the best time. Amazing guy to work with, amazing group of people, and it turned out to be wildly successful, beyond our imagination. And that led to a long-term relationship with Bob, where I've been able to work on a number of his pictures and just have a great time. Contact, Castaway, so it's been terrific with Bob. And then a couple of years ago, an independent film company which went public asked if I'd join them and organize a music department for them. I was Intermedia Films, and I did that with them for a while, and more recently have a co-financing deal with Cherry Lane Music to acquire copyrights and songwriters, and I'm still doing music supervision. Just finished working on Munich, the Spielberg picture, which comes out December 23rd. So that's kind of a thumbnail. It varies depending upon the composer. I used to say my job with John Williams, if he was scoring a picture like Indiana Jones, which was a Paramount picture, my job would be to walk over to his office on Friday and slide the check under the door. You know, that was about as much involvement as I'd have in that. On the other hand, there are composers that like the collaboration, like the assistance, and sometimes you give somebody an opportunity to get started. I gave James Newton Howard his first film, which was called Wildcats, at Warner Brothers, and then a bigger film, which was Everybody's All-American, which was with Taylor. And it's, you know, James was just fantastic because he wanted to learn the profession. As qualified as he is as a trained musician and an arranger and a composer, you know, it's a profession. And he learned it brilliantly. There were also other composers. James Horner, I had him do Star Trek II, which was his big studio break. I think James did that for like $10,000, you know? And you see composers get started like Elliot Goldenthal. His agent saw Drugstore Cowboy and Pet Sematary and said, this guy has something musically, and believed in him, and, you know, literally helped him get all the way to Frida and an Academy Award, you know. Not that that honor is the zenith, but I mean his music is, but it's terrific to see. I mean, you mentioned Syriana and the score, and I've been following Alexandre Desplat's work, and I think he's terrific and inevitably going to be a very important composer. So generally, the answer would be yes, but I mean that's to some degree where a publisher comes in or an administrator to determine what the package is and if it makes artistic sense to be involved. You have to take that on a case-by-case basis also. The benefits can be enormous. The benefits are, first of all, you get paid a fee for the song being used, and a fee for the record being used also. You then hopefully are on the soundtrack album if there is one, so you make money from record sales. The film then is played in foreign territories, and outside US and Canada, you receive what's called foreign theatrical performances, in which a portion of the ticket sale or a portion of the gross income of the film foreign-wise is allocated back to the music. And that's divided up amongst the participants who are in the soundtrack. And it can be a hefty amount if the film does good business overseas. Then you'll have the film come back to the United States and play on pay and cable, which there are performances. Then the film will go to free TV, network TV, where you also get paid again for the use. And then it will go into some form of syndication, where you get paid again. So it's a long-term revenue stream. I think there's more focus on it. And they've raised the prices. The publishers and the record companies have raised the prices because they recognize that the filmmakers, the commercial companies, for example, a company selling, you know, some soap or a Polaroid camera or something, the reason they can do a 15-second spot instead of a 1-minute spot is they'll use an identifiable song. And they're hoping that the audience will make the connection between the song and the product. In the film, the filmmaker wants to design a sequence, and he wants the music to be authentic and also to do something emotionally. So it's an important piece of material, and they'll pay for that. I think it's just more awareness about it. And plus, the filmmakers, as yourself, grew up in more a musical culture than earlier filmmakers. I think the earlier filmmakers grew up in more of a literary culture. Not saying that these filmmakers don't read, I'm just saying that there was a great deal of musical input that the earlier generations of film makers didn't necessarily have. So it's become a part of their culture. Cameron Crowe's a good example of that, as is Taylor Hackford. I think the best place to start and the best kind of basis to develop that is at a film studio. There's not a lot of them, but if you can get a job at a Disney or a Fox or a Paramount or a Warner Brothers, somehow into the music departments, that's going to give you the broadest range of information coming up from the bottom, because there's a ton of elements that are involved in it. It's not just sitting back and picking songs for a film. The mechanics of it are a lot more difficult than that. You need to know about publishing, you need to know about record companies, you need to know about record producers, you need to know about filmmakers, you need to know a ton of, what are the foreign rights versus the domestic rights when you're licensing material. I mean, there's thousands, literally thousands of elements that go into it, and like anything else from the outside, it appears to be just like this dream job where you just sit back and you put on prints and say, this is going to be perfect in this scene, which is the ideal world. That's fool's paradise, because there's an enormous amount of work that's going to go into getting that particular song approved by Prince and getting the money to pay for it and convincing all the people that it's the right choice for the right sequence. So the more you can get into the actual fundamental making of the movies in the business, in the musical area, even if it means working at a film scoring stage for a while, any of those elements would help, again, let you network and see a portion of what goes on.